The Preventative Hoover. Watch the Narcissist Stop You Leaving, Part 3. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. You've seen some footage and listened to the interaction between a narcissist and his victim as part of a Preventative Hoover. The victim in this instance had placed the material for public viewing as part of wanting people to understand what the individual has been dealing with and to share the nature of her experience. She has also explained more about the interaction between her and her abuser. And it's helpful to understand more of this background to provide context for what you've seen in parts 1 and 2, to also set the scene for further footage that you're going to be introduced to, and also to assist you with regard to your evaluation of the type of subschool of narcissist that Kay has been involved with. Naturally, the narc detector is the premier vehicle for ascertaining what type of narcissist you might be dealing with, because I provide you with that objective expertise. But it's also useful for you in your day-to-day dealings to exercise the learning that you have achieved here with me to see if you can narrow down the behaviours, the actions, the conduct, the outlook of a particular individual where you believe them to be a narcissist, to make an educated assessment as to what subschool they might be. So here's some more information and background to the situation involving Kay, the victim, and John, the narcissist. Kay is Canadian, but she now resides in the United States. She has 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. She works as a long-distance lorry driver. She was living in Canada when she first contacted John. John was in a prison in the United States for manslaughter when Kay first contacted him. Thus, we have an individual that is engaged in criminality and physical violence. He was convicted of killing an elderly man and claimed that this was in self-defense. John had been walking home high and drunk. Excessive use of alcohol and drugs, abrogation of responsibilities. He stopped at the property of an elderly man who was known locally for selling marijuana. The man refused to sell weed to John and demanded that he leave the property. An altercation followed where the man pulled a knife on John. John picked up a crowbar. Both fought and John killed the man. He then carried the body inside the home, a trailer, and set fire to the property with the dead body inside. John returned home, washed and bleached his clothes, washed and bleached a washing machine and dryer, thus disposing of evidence. Clearly, of course, recognizing that such evidence would be a threat to control, his narcissism drove him to destroy it. He was convicted of manslaughter because there was only circumstantial evidence available to convict him. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison and served 9 of those years before being released. He was 23 when he was convicted. John was abandoned by his mother as a child, potential lack of control environment. She later died of a drug overdose. John's father was physically abusive, lack of control environment, and pistol whipped John on a regular basis. It may well be the case that his father was also a narcissist. John was taken in by the family of one of his friends, but his behaviour deteriorated, and he began associating with gangs. John became a gang member, and Kay later found out that this particular gang was responsible for the assassination of rival gang members. Criminality. Kay watched a Netflix documentary about the segregation and treatment of inmates in prisons. She states that this documentary upset her because prisoners lost contact with their friends and family, exhibition of emotional empathy, were treated cruelly, and she felt they had no one and nothing to live for. Kay wanted to do something to offer these prisoners some form of support and encouragement in the hope that they would justly serve their time for their past crimes, but also that they might find the will to change, the desire to heal and fix, for them to be rehabilitated and live better lives. She found the website writeaprisoner.com, and for a week she researched the stories of the prisoners listed there. She wrote to 3 of these prisoners, 1 in Canada, 2 in the United States. She did not expect a response. Her intention was only to write a letter of encouragement. But a short time later, she received a reply from John, who was in a US prison. Kay responded, and frequent written communication began between the two. He was hoovering her. Kay viewed herself as a friend to John, but slowly over time she realized that her feelings had changed and they were of a romantic nature. She wrote and communicated with John via telephone for roughly 2 years. John was honest about the reason for his conviction, apparently was remorseful, and apparently wanted to change. Naturally, of course, knowing that he's a narcissist, such remorse was just false contrition, and promised change is a common manipulation utilised by narcissists, particularly those of a mid-range persuasion. Kay also made a trip from Canada to meet John in person. She travelled 2,500 miles for only an hour prison visit with John. She could not touch him. He was seated behind a glass screen in the high-security prison. When John was released 11 months after this visit, Kay was there to collect him with civilian clothes she had purchased for him. Kay demonstrating her emotional empathy for somebody that had been convicted of a crime, demonstrating her compassion, her caring nature, her desire to heal and fix. Kay recalls being particularly touched because John arrived with a bouquet of flowers that he had handpicked for her in the prison grounds before leaving. Triangulation with object. Kay was allowed to stay 6 months in the United States without a visa. She decided to stay the 6 months to help support John acclimatise to life outside of the prison. She then later acquired a US visa. Immediately after his release, John was staying at the home of his grandmother, but could only stay there for 60 days. John needed to find accommodation, but as a result of his criminal record and background checks undertaken by various landlords, he was unable to find a place to rent. Kay therefore rented a property in her name, and John moved into that rental property. Kay moved in with him a short time later, but at this point her intention was still to return to Canada. At the beginning of the relationship, everything seemed perfect, golden period, but as time passed, Kay began to notice certain concerning behaviours. John appeared to suffer from hallucinations. She describes an evening where the pair were calmly watching television, and John said that he saw the Grim Reaper standing in the hallway. He was genuinely terrified and would often get upset, cry and hide, afraid that demons would come for him in his sleep. Kay would stay up with him all night. Pity play, delusion. John purchased a machete for protection. Kay remembers that he would sit on the couch, sharpening it in front of her. She did not find this behaviour threatening until much later. Many things frustrated John. He'd been in prison for 9 years and the world had become more technology-based. He didn't know how to use an iPhone. He'd never used online banking. Things that at the start caused frustration began to make him extremely angry. Exhibition of heated fury as a consequence of threat to control. The fury then moved from finding life frustrating to also finding Kay frustrating. He began physically assaulting Kay. Lack of emotional empathy, physical assault. John would be extremely apologetic after any physical assault, false contrition. He appeared loving and affectionate, and Kay stayed with John as she believed that she could help him, emotional thinking corrupting her various empathic traits. She knew about this childhood, and she believed that John could deal with his past and change. Kay recognised that John had nothing and no one apart from her, underpinning her importance as the intimate partner primary source. John does have a sister. Kay credits a phone call with John's sister as the conversation that saved her life. Kay was beaten on multiple occasions. On one occasion, Kay awoke in the early hours to find John standing at the foot of their bed, dressed in a balaclava, top to toe in black, and holding the machete. John was standing there in the dark looking at her, intimidation. Kay leapt up to a standing position on the bed. Kay is 6 foot tall. She jumped off it, past John and out of the door. She ran half naked to the petrol station at the end of the road and hid there until morning. She had no phone, no wallet, and decided to go back to the house. She found John on the porch apologetic, false contrition. He claimed that he had dressed up as a joke, abrogation of accountability, but he was sorry for upsetting her. Kay believed him. On another occasion, John beat Kay and burst her eardrum. She couldn't swallow and so had to go to hospital. Kay had marks on her face and bruising on her throat. The doctor handed Kay domestic abuse paperwork, but Kay refused to report John, saying that her injuries occurred during a bar fight. Each time he assaulted Kay, John would apologise afterwards, false contrition, tell her that she was all that he had, and that he would promise to change. Promise changed. On one occasion, Kay went to the courthouse to get John committed to hospital. Kay feared for her life and for John's. He stayed in hospital and was diagnosed with bipolar 1 and periodic hallucinations. He was prescribed medication and released from hospital. John refused to take his medication, lack of accountability, and his behaviour further deteriorated. After one assault, Kay persuaded John to get counselling. John promised he would, but he ceased going after only a few sessions. Lack of accountability. Kay made contact with John's sister, who told Kay that she needed to leave him. She was in no doubt that her brother was going to murder Kay. It was this conversation that convinced Kay that she needed to escape. John beat Kay unconscious in her car. She awoke covered in blood from a head injury, but John refused to drive her to the hospital, lack of emotional empathy. Instead, John drove out into the middle of nowhere and kept driving until they were almost out of petrol. At this point, he stopped at a petrol station, and Kay was able to text a picture of herself to her friend. This friend contacted police, and the pair were located. John, still on parole, was taken in by police and questioned, but he was later released on bond. The Canadian embassy wouldn't help her as she was in the United States. Kay wasn't a US citizen and as such did not have access to services that other victims of domestic violence were able to make use of. When Kay finally did decide to move, she lived part of the time on the street and part of the time in a car that a friend gave to her. She kept moving as she was terrified that John would find her. John did repeatedly come looking for Kay. It was a part of trying to hoover her back in, and he also threatened the friend that had given the car to Kay. John was eventually charged with felonious assault, kidnapping with aggravated assault. The prosecution originally wanted to charge him with attempted murder, but this charge was dropped as Kay was unable to recall what John had in his hand as he hit her. Before her case went to trial, John was convicted and jailed for 3 counts of armed robbery, criminality. Kay was told that because John was now back in prison, her case would no longer go to trial, and she would never have her day in court. Kay states that the questions he's asked most often is, why? Why did you stay with him? She understands that to other people her behaviour seems crazy. He was, after all, a convicted murderer. What did she expect? Kay responds by pointing out that the relationship developed slowly. The abuse began gradually. But her reason for staying was really that she felt everyone deserved a second chance. She believed that she could help him, or that she could convince him to get help. Once he had a diagnosis of bipolar, she felt that it was unfair to give up on someone due to a mental disorder, sense of decency corrupted by emotional thinking. She wanted to help and support John to get better. John threatened to kill himself on several occasions, suicide threat, and again Kay felt responsible for him. She was concerned that he was unstable enough to go through with it, and she cared enough about him to want to help him to get better. People also questioned why she didn't return to Canada when she escaped him. Justice. Apparently, if she'd gone back to Canada, she wouldn't have been able to pursue a conviction in the United States. She feels bitterly disappointed that when she did eventually report John to police, and the police had evidence of her injuries, he was questioned but released on bond. This meant that following her attempt to escape him, he was able to repeatedly hoover her. Kay was contacted by John's probation officer. she was told that John had been told to move back to his grandmother's house. The rental property was in Kay's name, so John was not permitted to stay there. Kay was also assured by a neighbour that John was no longer living at the rental property. Kay drove back there, only to find that John hadn't left. She was wanting to collect her medication and some of her belongings. He had been hiding out at the property, and he attacked Kay again. Thus, some background to the interactions between Kay and John, which provides you with more context and also understanding for what you're going to hear about in the next part. Join me there.